Welcome to the Mental Insights Podcast, a conversation aimed at understanding all sides of mental health, addiction recovery, and homelessness. Each interview will include one's personal experiences and insights, or an expert's advice and knowledge within one of these fields. The goal is to promote awareness, guidance, and support for anyone who is affected by these challenges. Thank you all for listening. Welcome to the Mental Insights Podcast. This is your host, brendan.cutuli, and we are here today for Season 2, Episode number 15 with Tim Desmond. Tim is a faculty scholar at Antioch University, author of 3 books, and founder of 3 nonprofits. Tim studied at Plum Village, which led to the creation of the Morning Sun Mindfulness Center. And Tim's going to be joining the Mental Insights Podcast to speak within self-compassion of psychology and his new startup, Pure Collective. Tim, thanks for taking this time out to be here on the Mental Insights Podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Wonderful, Tim. So to start off within, why you really started this initiative throughout your whole life. You've already done some amazing things within briefing people within, the mental health industry. And I want to know what really brought you to want to study psychology and really make a change within the mental health industry.
Yeah, so I think my first interest is in meditation. And really like in sort of my own growth and kind of personal development and really, like finding happiness and kind of purpose and kind of creating a good life for myself. I think that really, so I grew up in Boston, had a single mom who was an active alcoholic for a lot of my childhood. And by the time I got to college, I was carrying around a lot of like trauma, sort of anger, anxiety. And by the time I got to college, my grades were awful in high school. I ended up in college actually because of a sports scholarship, or I probably wouldn't have been able to go to college. And by the time I got there, I was kind of looking for some direction in my life, like kind of like what do I want to be doing? And in a political science class, I was assigned the book "Peace is Every Step" by Thich Nhat Hanh. And that, when I read that book, it really clarified for me exactly what was missing from my life. That's sort of like what he was talking about in terms of mindfulness and compassion and a sense of inner well-being that is that is not dependent on things going the way that you want them to. It sounded like, it was a completely novel idea for me. And it just really felt like something that was totally new. And so, as 19-year-olds sometimes do when they find something that really makes sense to them, I kind of stopped doing everything else and just completely dove into understanding meditation and mindfulness and specifically Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings. That was like all I really wanted to learn about. And as soon as I could, I spent time at Plum Village monastery where Thich Nhat Hanh lived, and then I would sort of follow him around as much as I could as he would go on tours in the US and in Europe. I just sort of tag along whenever I could, and I spent a lot of my 20s going back and forth between spending time in the monastery and then being involved in various kind of grassroots social change movements, whether it was the World Trade Organization protests, the Iraq War protests, Occupy Wall Street, just like all sort of living in the middle of those spaces for a while where there's a tremendous amount of stress and kind of craziness and trying to contribute to the world in that way. And then once those sort of like, and then in between each one, I'd go back to the monastery and try to continue developing myself and sort of my own ability to be grounded and aware, and yeah, and having that sense of inner strength that doesn't depend on things being perfect around me.
Thank you for that, Tim. It certainly shows why, a sense of purpose, or like you said, kind of seeing within yourself of, why there can be something, to delve into, and that, some of these experiences in your life can bring you to some of this, moment of awakening. And, I do have kind of a similar experience such as yourself. I grew up facing, certain challenges, experience a trauma, and it kind of led me to this, same whirlwind until I was in college as well, and kind of had this sense of awakening of, struggle is okay. Struggle is okay within your life, because it allows you to take that next step. And why don't you speak more about kind of that topic of how we're able to learn to accept struggle, and as well how we're able to use that kind of as a moment to move forward, and that moment of healing to take that next step within our life.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So when I was in college, aside from being interested in Buddhism, I was really interested in social change kind of movements. And I was reading about various nonviolent revolutions in history, and like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Gandhi, and was really affected by those philosophies. And there was a point, so I was really trying to take those things seriously and kind of be the type of person that King and Gandhi and would describe, until I saw that it really wasn't working for me. So what happened was, I was in my semester abroad in India, and I was actually at a NGO called the Institute for Gandhian Studies, and it was like a place where in sort of central India, where people would sort of study the life and history of the sort of Indian independence movement, and specifically like the sort of nonviolence part of that. And I was really trying to be the kind of person that Gandhi described as someone who like doesn't have hate, doesn't have anger, who is just sort of brings peace to whatever situation they're in. And there was a point just being like I remember living in this sort of dorm area, totally immersed in these ideas, and something just sort of clicked in me of, I still have a lot of anger and resentment, specifically at my father, who I never met. And I remember just like this whole idea. So I was reading a lot of Gandhi, and I was also reading about various sort of books about psychology at the same time, and learning about sort of psychological repression. And what I realized was that the message that I was getting from these great social change leaders, the way that I was interpreting that was basically repress and ignore whatever parts of yourself are not convenient, are not like who you want to be. And it occurred to me in that place that that's just not going to work for me. And that there's not a way for me to kind of just decide that I don't want to have those emotions, that I just don't want to have those feelings. And that's when I kind of got deeper into Buddhism, and sort of deep. And what ended up clicking for me was this idea that of being able to accept whatever thoughts or feelings I might have. It they don't need to define me, and they don't need to sort of be how I'm going to act in the world, but just by allowing myself to have whatever feelings come up, allowing myself to have whatever resentments or anger or fears, just allowed me to be like, not just allowed me to be more of a whole person, but allowed me to actually feel like less, like more accepting toward other people that were not, because I feel like one thing that was happening for me as I was getting deeper into learning about, various people talking about nonviolent social change, the way that I was interpreting what they were saying is like there's a right way for everybody to act, and if they're not acting that way, then they're doing it wrong. And I just had this like intense judgmental streak in me, both about me, like how there was only one right way for me to do it, and there was only one right way for anyone else to do it. And what happened, the more I had that politically, the more I had that sort of sense of there's one right way to be, the more kind of judgmental I felt towards other people, and like the less kind of a sense of warmth that I felt toward people, because there was like, I was always kind of looking for like, well, are they actually radical enough? Are they actually, is there some sort of impurity to how they're handling a situation? And I see that a lot in political movements and sort of people and sort of like in woke culture. And I think it's fucked up. And I think I think that in order for actual compassion and transformation to be possible, we need to be able to learn how to acknowledge that everybody has all the feelings. And if we can allow for that, then that's kind of like the beginning of compassion. Like compassion doesn't come from like policing people's behavior in the most rigid possible way. It comes from learning how to accept what's human in us and like relate to it with love and care.
For most people, it needs kind of, whether it's a large event, or whether it's going to a monastery, whether it's having a certain experience in order for them to take this time to look within themselves. Because often for most people, they can't just sit down and reflect and look within themselves to say, all right, maybe this is how I can come into acceptance of my emotions, of my thoughts, whether they need to work with a professional. And I think for, a lot of people today, of what they face with, some of the, episodes of depression, with social anxiety, with, anxiety in general, a lot of people have, these expectations within life of, oh, I need to do this, I need to do that, or I won't be where I need to be, or where my parents or where my, peers see myself. And for people especially, it's getting into the work field, getting into, whatever they feel passionate about. But, for yourself, you took that leap of faith once you were able to see what was truly, rooted within, all right, mindfulness and meditation is something that, I need to delve within. And, I think touching a little bit more upon this, of for people who are listening, who are maybe, not sure of, like yourself, maybe they weren't the best in terms of school and education right now. Maybe they weren't gifted as an athlete for them to propel them into, a professional realm. For people who maybe haven't had the chance to look within themselves, how are you able to take that step of saying, all right, I want to take this time to go study in Plum Village. I want to go take this time to, take within myself to be a part of this, social activism. What allowed you to take that transition? And, how it, for someone listening that maybe has people around them pulling in different directions, how can they kind of see why they may need to take that leap of faith within their life, and maybe even take 6 months or maybe a year just to
Yeah.
focus on themselves, and maybe go to a similar type of center, monastery, or even just working with someone professionally to focus on one rooted, whether it's a trauma or experience, emotions that they need to work through.
Yeah. So I grew up poor, and I think because of that, I was never afraid of being poor. And I think that there are a lot of people who are. And I think that if you're afraid of being poor, then you don't have the freedom to do what's actually meaningful for you. Like you feel like you can't live life based on your actual values, because you're like, okay, well, I can live life based on my values within this narrow band of also having however much money I think I need. And I think having grown up poor, it was sort of like I remember my mom told me, if you're smart and you're willing to work hard, then you can do whatever you want. But actually, it was like, if you're smart and you're willing to work hard and you're willing to be poor, then you can do whatever you want. And so it's like, you can't have like, there's I don't know, like you could think about how, like, whatever, trying to have that sort of as a formula, but I guess what I could say for myself is like, whatever is getting in the way, for anybody who's listening, whatever is getting in the way of you living out your values in a more kind of full way, just ask yourself if it's actually, if that thing is actually worth it. Like, do you really need that thing? There's a story that Thich Nhat Hanh tells, and it's about it's a Buddhist sort of parable. So the Buddha had gone out begging with all of the monks, and after they had gotten their food offering, they were sitting on a hill down to eat what they'd been given. And so we say monks, but the actual the Sanskrit Pali word for that we're translating is bhikshu, which just means beggar. So it was like the Buddha and all of the other beggars were sitting down to enjoy whatever food they'd been given that day. And they were sitting down, and a farmer ran up and was kind of screaming and said, "Monk, have you seen my cow?" And the Buddha said, "No, I haven't seen your cow." And he said, "I've lost my cow. All I had in the world was this cow. Like, I had a small sesame crop and insects ate it. And the last thing I had in this world was my cow. And I woke up this morning and it's gone. And if I don't find it, I'm going to kill myself." And the Buddha said, "I'm sorry, your cow didn't come this way. You should look in the other direction." Then the farmer left. And he looked down at all of the monks and he said, "How lucky you are that you have no cow to lose." And it's this idea of like, none of us have cows. We just beg. And this person is just like, "I'm going to kill myself if I can't find my cow." And I think that there's like, especially in this sort of discussion, I don't know, I think these are things that we all have to kind of face as an individual, like looking at our own lives. But the thing that I really want people to look at in terms of being able to live like a really meaningful, really kind of purposeful life is a lot of the things that we feel like we might need, that might be sort of non-negotiable, that might be like, "Oh, I couldn't live without this." So what are the cows in your life? What are the things that you think you need, and actually you'd be a lot freer without them? And I think that that's a really good exercise for people to think about, because when you give away your cow, now you don't have to worry about your cow. And it's just, life can be easier.
I love that analogy. Thank you for that. It definitely puts into perspective of, essentials of at the root of, human beings, what truly are our necessities. And, if you break that down, you could really see what will help you, move throughout, whatever you do feel passion, towards, whatever you truly are rooted within. And I think that's, why we do see so many people, struggling with these issues, because they think that they need to have certain things within their life in order for them to, whether it's, reach fulfillment, reach happiness. And, there's so many misconceptions, I believe, within society today in terms of, what is truly rooted within the human condition and what we truly need to feel fulfillment and find, this purpose that we all say within our life. And, to really speak about self-compassion, I think this is something that not a lot of people have enough awareness about in terms of really what it is. And, as I've read and, digested some of the, the content that you've put out within this realm, I think it's important to first kind of categorize what it even is. And I want you to kind of explain the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion, and, speak more about the, the rooted, really driving force between self-compassion and how we're able to find that within ourselves.
Yeah. Well, so self-esteem, we can think about self-esteem as sort of like, people use the word. So the one thing people use these words in really different ways. So I just want to say, like, I'm not attached to, people use the word self-esteem to mean a lot of different things. There's a distinction that I want to think about, though, and these words can be helpful. So to what extent, when we think about a positive way of relating to yourself, to what extent is that about thinking that, okay, I have a positive way of relating to myself because I think that I am better than other people, because I think about the things that about me that are above average, that compare well to other people. And if you're thinking about, so I have a positive way of relating to myself because I'm thinking about the ways that I'm better than other people, that's kind of a fragile form of self-love. It's like, because as soon as you're not better, and like, no one can be better at everything, and certainly not everyone can be above average. And so there are these ways of like, we can be grateful for these gifts, but if that's why we think we deserve love, because the ways that we're better than average, then again, yeah, it's like anytime you don't succeed at something, or anytime that you're comparing yourself to someone who's even better, it's going to feel like you don't deserve love anymore. And so when I talk about self-compassion, one of the ways that I want to emphasize it is the idea that you're someone who deserves love just because you're alive. Like, you're a living being, and there's no other reason needed for you to deserve like love and care, and to sort of like to sort of to relate to yourself, like to see the beauty and to see the lovableness in yourself, like, yeah, not because you earned it, but just because you're here. And I think that for me, so a lot of like researchers, they'll say that idea of self-esteem is sort of like, I'm lovable because I'm better than average, which means all those people who are below average aren't really that lovable. Self-compassion is like relating to yourself with compassion, and it doesn't need a reason other than just you're a living being that just like has needs. So then in terms of relating to ourselves with self-compassion, that I feel like is a more transformative way, it's the challenge or the practice of whatever part of you, the parts of you that you like, relating to those sort of with like gratitude and warmth, and whatever part of you that you don't like, learning how to relate to those parts of you with care and kindness. And so that's ultimately for me what it means to develop self-compassion. It starts off with, I'm learning in myself that all the things that I like and all the things that I don't like, I can relate to with kindness and care. And then as soon as I start realizing that, like, the part of me that's impatient, I can have some kindness toward, then when I see someone else being impatient, not a trigger at all. But if I'm constantly trying to tell myself, stop being impatient, then someone else being impatient, I get triggered by it. So there's like this like relationship there between self-compassion and compassion for others.
Wonderful. I really like that, description about it, because it definitely comes into play in terms of, when someone's obviously going through a therapeutic session, they're allowed really the perspective in order to look at themselves, their behaviors, their thoughts, their emotions in a new perspective. And for some people, per se, they're not really able to gain that perspective on their own. So, they're not able to just within their everyday say, all right, this is what I'm doing today, or this is how I feel. And, trying to look within themselves at that normal level. And I want to know how really mindfulness and meditation can be that essential component of self-compassion in order to, look within yourselves and try to digest when you should be grateful and when you should be caring towards maybe something that you do need to improve upon.
Yeah. So I think that for me, the relationship between self-compassion and mindfulness is when we stop and pay attention to ourselves. That's when we kind of start to notice the ways that we're judging ourselves, the ways that, like, how are we relating to ourselves? Most of the time we're not aware of how we're relating to ourselves. We're aware of how we're relating to the world around us, right? It's sort of like if your partner is not acting the way that you want them to, you're aware of like, oh, you're like thinking about how you want them to be different. And then what happens in mindfulness practice is you stop and then you notice your mind wanting your partner to be different. And you name that as like, oh, that there's like a lot of craving there. There's a lot of desire. There's a lot of fear there. And what you start to do is your focus isn't so much on what's going on with your partner and how do you want them to be different. You're sort of like, what's going on with your own mind and how are you not accepting the world as it is? And so you start to notice like, oh, wow. Yeah, when thoughts of my partner come up, there's this like real kind of almost desperation that comes up of like wanting them to do a certain thing. And so I'm just going to like feel that wanting for a minute. And so I just start by feeling it. And then there's that wanting, and I really want something. And then when I name it as wanting, then it's like, okay, now I'm feeling it, and I'm noticing in my body how like what my body feels like when I'm really wanting that, sort of this graspiness and agitation. And then the next step is I start to look at what is it that I really want. I start to look, like inquire into it. And I see the humanity there, which is like, what I'd really want is for my partner to always understand me and be kind to me and do everything that I want them to. And then again, so that right in that moment, and this is where we switch, this is where self-compassion comes in. Because I notice that's the want in me. I notice like what I want is for everybody to always love and understand me and do what I want them to. And then the question is, do I respond to that with disgust toward myself of like, what an immature, unreasonable thing to want? Or do I respond to that with compassion of like, everybody wants that? That's part of being human, is to sort of wish that people always did what you wanted. Like, yeah, that's totally, there's not a single person that doesn't always have that wish. And that for me is sort of is what it feels like that where mindfulness moves into self-compassion. It's like I'm noticing there's this desire, I'm feeling this desire, but instead of being like, oh, that desire is dumb, I'm going to try not to have it, or I'm just going to like dissociate from it or whatever, it's going to be like, oh, that's just part of being human. Like everybody feels that way. And then I can sort of feel this release and feeling comforted.
It's certainly, in my opinion, probably one of the best practices that I've been able to incorporate within, my everyday, since it as we're saying, it allows you to kind of pick up on some of these thoughts and behaviors that you may not have noticed just in your everyday. And, obviously we all have these constant, ruminations, these constant thoughts throughout our day, and it may lead us astray to certain different directions within our life. But for most people, they don't really have this, set avenue in order to do this, even say healing work, unless they're working in a therapeutic measure, unless they are practicing these on their own. And, I want you to maybe take this time as maybe a pitch to somebody as to, why healing work is important, even if you aren't facing a trauma throughout your past life, or you don't have these feelings of constant remorse or regret within your life. If you don't have any sense of challenge within your life today, still, why is the practice of mindfulness and meditation a good approach to your life? And what are some positives that it could bring about within an everyday person?
Well, I mean, I think that the thing is, like, if somebody has to sell you on why to practice mindfulness, then maybe you shouldn't. I think the issue is, like, if you're somebody who, when you look at yourself, you're like, I want to have more of a sense of freedom and joy and fearlessness. Like, I want to be someone who embodies whatever they are. If you look at yourself and you say, I want to embody certain qualities in my life more than I do, and I don't want those qualities to be dependent on, like, getting what I want. Like, I want them to be in me in whatever situation. Then what I would say is, get clear about what those qualities are and train yourself in them. So those qualities might include presence. They might include compassion. They might include fearlessness. But it doesn't matter. It's like, whatever they are for you, training yourself in the qualities that you want to embody in the world just makes sense once you realize that that's possible. And then if you don't have the time or energy to it, then I would be like, well, what are you doing that's so important? Is there really anything else in your life that you feel like is more important than being the person that you want to be? So for me, that's how I relate to it.
Wonderful, Tim. I appreciate that. It certainly shows the value of your perspective on life, because what you were able to do is you were able to take this time and not work towards any external measures within your life. You took this time to work internally within this practice of mindfulness and meditation, and I think it shows as to why people have to want that personal development. They have to want to go and work towards a common goal of improving themselves within their everyday. So I love that piece of advice. And I want to thank everybody for listening to this first part of the episode with Tim Desmond. Below in the show notes, you can see all of the links towards Tim's work and see more of what he is doing today. Please be sure to check out the next part of the episode, where we'll be speaking about Peer Collective, a new startup that Tim is creating, really trying to work within the avenue of providing therapeutic resources at an affordable level. So please be sure to tune into that episode to hear more about the resources that Tim is providing and why it is something that you should be tuning into now. So thank you all again for listening. This was the 15th episode of season 2 of the Mental Insights podcast, and we'll see you shortly in the next episode.
Thank you all for listening to today's episode of the Mental Insights podcast. Make sure to reach out to today's guest or myself if you need any advice, guidance, or support in your life today. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and review to this podcast so we know what you thought of this episode. I look forward to being in touch with you all in the next episode. I hope you all have a wonderful day.